All right, so can you hear me all right? I'm not used to speaking into a mic. Just a little bit of background on me. I graduated from Linfield College back in May of 2011, and I was a philosophy major. My thesis was, basic subject was the metaphysics and ethics of participation in video games, and this is a subsection of that thesis, particularly dealing with video games in relation to sport. And before I get started, I just want to thank the conference and the committee for accepting my paper, inviting me to speak here. This has been a fantastic conference in a beautiful city, so I'll try and keep it short so we can all get out and enjoy it. The title of the talk is Cybersport 2.0, Ethical Dimensions of Video Games, by me, obviously. And so this is my thesis. As a society, we place great value in participation in sports. This value was manifested in two levels. The prima facie good that we attribute to sports is fitness and the playful engagement in exercise activities. However, it is arguable that the primary good that society bestows upon sports is the ability to develop character within those who participate. Unfortunately, video games are considered to exist on the opposite end of the spectrum. Video games have the greater societal stigma that they drive participants into isolation and antisocial behavioral patterns. Any morally redemptive characteristics are conspicuous by their absence within the stigma. I propose that video games standing in society requires reconsideration in the light of tremendous progress made in regard to technology and the subsequent complexity of the video games that permeate the market today. I intend to argue that video games and sports in their classic renditions are engaged in many of the same ways, and that now with the advent of motion gaming platforms, video games have drastically blurred these distinctions in a sufficient capacity as to warrant a reevaluation towards similar values that we attribute to sports. The argumentation will proceed with an analysis of key aspects of Dennis Hemphel's original Cybersport article and the reapplication of these ideas in respect to motion gaming, and a metaphysical analysis on the state of games and a discussion about the advantages that they afford us will follow respectively. Obviously, things have fit in quite well with this conference, so we've covered a few of these topics more in depth, but I'll briefly sort of address them to bring them into the discussion. So in Hemphel's original article, Cybersport, he addresses these two key ideas: player character identification and body controller synthesis. Come on. Why aren't you working? There we go. Okay. So player character identification is the phenomenon we've discussed earlier, I believe, on the first day, where the gamer tends to forget. He refers to himself in the first person. We don't say when an in-game action occurs, the carrier of Mario that I'm controlling with this remote control just jumped off a cliff or fell down a ravine. We say, I did these things. So there is a momentary transference of identity from the player into the game and recognizes with the game character. The key part of this is that it sort of eliminates all these degrees of physical separation that we seem to experience, because when we're playing, we have a TV or a monitor, a game console, a remote control, an actual physical distance, and all of that evaporates, and the actions that we are performing through the controller that manifest on the screen, all those things that translate that all gets compacted into one first-person account of the events happening on screen. The next concept that he talks about is body controller synthesis. Hemphill discusses the physical and mental interaction between the player and the controller interface that is used to play the game. A skilled gamer, much like a batter or golfer, finds that the controller becomes an extension of the body. This was discussed in one of the keynote speakers yesterday, where when we first start playing, when we first address the game controller, we are battling with becoming familiar with it, much like a golf club or a sword or a tennis racket. It's this foreign object attached to our body that we're learning how to navigate and operate creatively and effectively with. But once we become familiar with these objects, they become much more natural. That we know how to hold them, we know how to address them, we know exactly how to execute a given action. Given the time, I'm not going to be using the videos. In summation, Hemphill states that in spite of the fact that the game player occupies a third-person perspective, I'm including all game perspectives, in this particular game, the distinction between the game player and the game character seems to disappear or at least merge in the lived experience. In phenomenological terms, the game controller as an extension of the body recedes into the background, so to speak, and the player becomes immersed in the action. Okay, so now we're going to take a quick look just at how the way of interacting with the video game has evolved over the years. So, as you can see, we've come quite a long way. This is the original Atari. It was before my time, so I don't even know the full title for it, but this was the remote control that they used for the Atari. Very simple. Obviously, something that you walk right up to and you have sort of an instant image of exactly what you're supposed to do with it. This is the current controllers that we have, which also, they have the same sort of mystique or they lie to the user. You walk up to them like a golf club or a bat, and it seems so very simple. Here's this thing that fits right in your hand. It goes just like this, and it seems as though it's not intimidating at all. And then you start to actually use it. Like for the first time, you swing a golf club, and you think, this should be easy. I just hit the ball, and it'll go flying that direction. And next thing you know, you swing, and it's still sitting right at your feet. So we have to become very familiar with this, what is in fact a very complex piece of machinery in order to perform the task that we're looking for. And then we have, obviously, the new sort of frontier of motion gaming, where there's a mixture of using our knowledge of how to play a game with our own, or merging that with a new knowledge of using our body and in a more traditional sense, and actually performing the actions instead of pressing a button. I'm going to skip that video. So I'm going to sort of demonstrate this by looking at two examples. One, just a brief demonstration of performing and executing a kill in a Halo Reach multiplayer scenario and making a tackle in an American football scenario. So when you're playing Halo, you first enter a deathmatch area. The first thing you have to do is become aware of your surroundings. You need to know where you're going, what you're doing, becoming familiar with the environment, and then so you start moving around, and you're doing that with one thumb. And then as you're doing that, all of a sudden a guy pops onto the screen. You're like, oh, all right, got to kill this guy. And so you start using your other thumb, you start to take aim, start moving the target into distance, and slowly start pulling the trigger. With the advancement of technology, now it's not simply just hold onto the trigger and 15,000 bullets fly out and kill him. You have to pace your shots, you have to be accurate, and all the while, he's trying to do the exact same thing to you. So you have this very dynamic relationship in which you're assessing where you are, what weapon you have, where your enemy is, where your teammates are, because you can kill a guy with a rocket launcher, but he's surrounded by 3 people. Who really cares? You just killed 3 of your teammates. So just demonstrating the complex scenarios that seem incredibly simple, but in fact there's so many other mental processes that are going into evaluating the situation. So the next scenario is an American football scenario, and we'll be talking about this sort of from the perspective of a linebacker who is in charge of tackling the running back or the receiver, whoever gets the ball once the play is started. So the linebacker, much like the game player when he first enters the situation, has to instantly become aware within the beginning of the play, within moments, are they trying to throw the ball? Are they trying to run the ball? Is it a sneak play? What exactly do I need to do? And once that becomes evident, this is our linebacker. So he is here obviously thinking very, very hard. And he's assessing all the action that's going on in front of him, all the factors, where his teammates are, how the offense is lined up, what play the offense is running. And once the offense makes it known what they're doing, when he identifies where the ball is going, He has to judge his speed, how fast he is, how strong he is. Are his teammates in the way? Is there a blocker? How does he get from point A to point B to tackle the ball carrier? It seems you don't just run. You can't just run. You have all these other factors to take into, and then once you're actually there to take out your enemy, just like in the video game, you have to combine this series of activities, i.e., ramming yourself into them, wrapping up with your arms, exploding forward with your hips, and eventually producing a fairly intense collision. And with the advent of motion gaming, with these new technologies, what we'll see is something that I think where these possible sports can go. The movie Real Steel, I haven't actually seen it. I've seen advertisements of it. But what you have is robots have assumed the roles of boxers, and the actual athlete is outside the ring, and a computer or some sort of mechanism reads their body, and they are essentially controlling the robot, the avatar, and combating and going through this combat scenario. And this is where we'll start to get into how I think motion gaming can help advance the discussion of video games as sport. So since the release of the Nintendo Wii several years ago, there have been over 100 million motion gaming peripherals sold on the market. It's become an exploding phenomenon. So to understand how we can start to consider these games on a equal level, I'm going to turn to Huizinga's an original aspect of his definition of sport. Huizinga's classical definition of sport involves presence of an extraordinary realm in which games and sports take place. And the way I sort of think about this is and this was brought up earlier in the week, is there's these sort of separate realities that are constructed momentarily for these games and for sports and for games. We impose these rules which directly interfere with efficiency. So in a soccer game, the point is to kick the ball into the net. Well, it wouldn't be much fun if one of your friends showed up to a soccer game, took the ball, jumped in his car, drove to the other end, hit the goalie, got out, and kicked the ball into the goal. It's not really the point of the game. So we impose these rules. You have to use your feet. You have to play against people. You have all these lines. And we construct all of these artificial rules, artificial laws that require us to perform a task in a certain way. And if we don't follow these laws, it essentially destroys the reality. It becomes increasingly aware or drastically aware that we are in fact playing a game. And obviously with respect to video games, these rules are manifest in very concrete programming, how the game is constructed on the disc. So the advantages of playing video games, I think, come into three categories: accessibility, replayability, and emotional and moral exploration. Accessibility, what I mean by this is it's two different forms of accessibility. There's the accessibility of being available and the accessibility of becoming able to perform. So obviously sports, soccer, baseball, basketball, widely accessible, but they require a high degree of organization. It's incredibly difficult to get 6 people together to play 3-on-3 basketball, let alone 22 people together to play an 11-on-11 football game. So the need for the number of people to play the game is reduced infinitely, and to the point where if the player wishes to participate with the realm, he needs only press a button. All right. Also, time limitations. Sports can only occur at certain times in certain places on a competitive level. And also, you can only play for 90 minutes or 2 hours or 3 hours, those kinds of things. And in a study conducted on the educative properties of games with young black men, it was found that some mentioned that games were a way to play sports when the real-world option was not available. such as when it was too warm or too cold to play outside, or when no one was available to play with. So if you're in an environment, say moderate isolation, and you can't go walk down the street to play with your buddies, you can have this machine that gives you access instantly to the internet, to this world of players anywhere from Britain to China and anywhere in between. And the second part of accessibility is that a key part of video games is technology. That's the whole premise behind motion gaming, is there's this technology is integral to how games are constructed and march forward. And in traditional sports, technology doesn't really mean that technology is seen with a certain sort of a dangerous area to go into. And that's particularly stark with cases of Oscar Pistorius, who was obviously handicapped. He had his legs amputated at the age of 11 months old. And in 2008, he was one of the Olympic hopefuls competing out of, I believe it was England. But all in this time where he's been trying to compete, he's faced a lot of resistance because technology has made him capable of competing. But at the same time, he's not seen to be in the same sphere or treated in the same way as a normal athlete, whereas in video games, where technology can once again make a player capable, instead of, not sort of a cheesy way, but not handicapped, but handy-capable, as they would say, there isn't that stigma. If you are able to acquire a piece of technology that once again allows you to participate in the activity, that's not something that's seen as a negative aspect, but something that is beneficial. The next aspect is replayability. So like I said, when participating in sports, they happen at particular moments and particular times, and they place a lot of emphasis on how do you perform in the moment, in the clutch. At this exact moment, do you do this exact thing that allows you to overcome and become victorious? And while this can be revealing, it can also be detrimental, because there's so many ways in which a situation can go poorly even outside of your control. And video games offer the opportunity where you can go back and go through these events and see what you did wrong, how you can produce a different outcome. And that is an opportunity that isn't capable in sports. Even if you get the same teams together, set up the exact same scenario, and carry out the same play, it's never going to be the exact same moment, quite like you can get in a video game. And finally, I think games can offer a much more dynamic, if not valuable, supplemental aspect for what I would call emotional and moral exploration. In those moments, those peak moments, that's where coaches and announcers say, this is where you see what a man is really made of. But really, that's not a fair judgment to judge the character and the capabilities of an athlete based on a couple of seconds. And a point in case of this would be, there was a few weeks ago, there was the NFL divisional championship game, and both games were settled by last-minute field goals. One kicker missed his field goal, and the other made it. And throughout the week, you heard how one was a very clutch player and very good, and while the other guy, where this is one of the few field goals he's missed all year, just because he missed this one, you question exactly how his moral fortitude. Okay, so before we get to the conclusion, actually, I was just going to a personal anecdote real quick. I came across the same kind of thing when I was playing Fable 3. I'm faced with the situation as the protagonist where I've overthrown the rule of my virtual brother, and I have the chance to exact revenge for the people who obviously, when you overthrow the king, they want to hang him. and you can choose to either execute or save him. And on this playthrough, I was trying to make all evil decisions, which doesn't come naturally to me. But when I came to this juncture in the game, I sat there sort of staring at the screen, and I became aware that I was physically and emotionally uncomfortable executing this virtual character. And it quite literally took my roommate chanting at me to do it before I finally did. And it sounds crazy. Sometimes I can't believe I actually admit to this. But similarly, after I became the king, I had given promises to people who helped me rise to power, and I was given the chance to break or fulfill these promises, even though it would affect how much work I would have to do to achieve another goal. And once again, I found myself incredibly uncomfortable breaking these promises, and I realized that in the most sort of Kantian sense, I was treating these characters as ends in themselves and not simply means to an end. And I find that personally very compelling, to say when a 22-year-old kid can look at a video game and not want to hurt them for some reason. Maybe that's just a commentary on me, but. So I'll just try and sum this up real quick. The application of arguments from Hemphill Cybersport have been integral in demonstrating the applied skills, both mental and physical, needed to play video games skillfully. The entrance of motion gaming has hurled another stone at the classic requirements of at least getting up off the couch. And finally, through a metaphysical analysis of sports and video games, we see that they are engaged on equal planes, or almost equal. And in fact, video games may offer a much more dynamic, or at least valuable, supplemental learning opportunity than those attributed to traditional sports. The advances in motion gaming technology bring into consideration the future of video game athletes playing traditional sports in a virtual media and affording less able participants the opportunity to enjoy a sport experience. It is for these reasons that I feel it is time to reevaluate the status of video games as both a form of entertainment and a didactic resource in the development of an individual's moral and ethical constitution. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was a very nice kind of contribution, and also a very nice way in which we can say that the philosophy of computer games has some link to actual realities outside of the gaming world. So thank you very much. And now I would ask the members of the program committee to come up to the front, and we'll try and make a half circle so that everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I jumped the gun. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I know we're pressed for time, so I wasn't.
No. I just forgot.
I need my 15 minutes. Man.
I know you need your 15 minutes. I need 20 minutes.
All right.
Okay. No, sorry. I apologize, Phil. I'm getting a bit tired myself. Okay, first question's over here. I could see the horror on the faces of the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm down here.
Okay, sorry.
Electronically mediated, as always. I'm just thinking that I think these very sort of to the point points about what these things afford are really good, but I'm thinking that you might want to distinguish a little bit between the different layers of technology and infrastructure that's actually involved here, because I think we all take for granted that Xbox Live exists nowadays. Mm-hmm. Internet gaming and all these things, but I think some of the things that you say that it can bridge time and space, those are actually quite sort of complex problems within both, theories of infrastructure, but also theories of media, that they do these in different ways. And I think that might make for some problems with the real world as well, with time zones and stuff like that. But it's really more of a comment that I think that a historical analysis, as you also point to, it's not just about interfaces, it's also about the vast infrastructure that goes into the gaming worlds as we now know them, and especially esports that are often facilitated by way of these huge infrastructures underneath what's going on. So
yeah, absolutely. One of the things I address in the paper is, although these games are incredibly accessible to those that they're available to, obviously there's a large population in the world that doesn't have access to electricity, let alone TVs and internet. So
well.
Yeah, so it is limited, but I guess one of the points I'm trying to make is it's not a perfect replacement for sports, but I believe that we're doing a disservice as a society to dismiss it as an antisocial habit. So.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to comment on the accessibility you pointed out. Wouldn't that be kind of a just different kind of accessibility? Because, for instance, if you don't have electricity, then you wouldn't have a football game digitally, but you might still be able to play football outside. Or, in the case of Pistorius, if you miss a thumb instead of both legs, he wouldn't be able to play Xbox, but he would be still able to run. So I think this is just a question of different kind of access.
Yeah, and that's what I tried to bring up with that point, is there's a difference between the accessibility for those that it's available to and those that it isn't. I mean, obviously, if you own an Xbox or a computer, you can press that button and instantly connect it to people across the world. But to a certain extent, if sprinting was taking place, you could, instead of having this giant meet of people for the Olympics, people could just stand in front of their TVs. Obviously, the technology isn't really here for this, but would it really matter that much if Pistorius had those prostheses like he does? Obviously, it isn't a perfect model because it is limited by technology, and but I'm more trying to speak to the future where it could go with this technology, where you can give these experiences to a handicapped person, someone who isn't capable of experiencing these sort of sporting events in the traditional format, perhaps getting a very similar and equally valuable experience through video games.
So it's like more like a supportive function,
yeah,
rather than an
supplemental.
extending. No.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so were there any other questions? Comments? Okay. Who was first?
Okay. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on certain uses of technology in games that are looked upon as morally questionable. Like I'm thinking of botting, in particular in online games, and yeah, like where those boundaries lie and how you would relate that to the boundaries in sports, I guess.
Absolutely. Modding, because my background is mostly with console gaming, so usually in modding with console games, there aren't dedicated servers to specific game mods, and that would fall under the category of cheating because they're playing with players who aren't modding the game, so they're giving themselves really an unfair advantage. And like I tried to say during the talk, when you introduce things like that, like the car to the soccer game, all of a sudden you've destroyed the reality of the game. And to a certain extent, I believe it's the player's sort of moral responsibility not to do that, to uphold the reality. Otherwise, you destroy the value of playing altogether. So, but certainly on like a Counter-Strike server where they say you can call in airstrikes whenever you want or something to that effect, if that's the accepted rules of the game and they've altered that to become an acceptable practice, then I would consider that to be a fair use of technology. So, does that answer your question?
Sure.
All right.
Okay, were there any last questions? Okay, thank you very much.